In this episode of Trust Talk, we explore one of the most pressing issues of our time, immigration. Our guest, Zeke Hernandez, author of the book The Truth About Immigration, challenges the myths and misconceptions that fuel fear and division. He exposes the disinformation and political narratives that distort public perception and influence trust in our societies. Through his research and compelling perspective, Zeke reveals the real impact of immigration on our economies and communities, urging us to rethink the narrative. Join us as we cut through the noise and uncover the facts about immigration. This is an episode you won't want to miss. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Welcome, Zeke, to Trust Talk. I'm glad you are our guest today, speaking about a topic that could not be more relevant today, immigration. It's an issue that sparks strong emotions. It dominates political debates, and it shapes public trust in institutions, communities, and even economies. Yet much of the discussion seems to be driven by fear rather than facts. And so I'm happy today that you are our guest to see whether you could actually help us through the facts and try to diminish the fear. You wrote a book, it's called The Truth About Immigration, and you challenge many of the myths surrounding immigration, and the book offers a very compelling perspective on what's really happening. Before we dive into the specifics, let me start with the big question. Immigration is at the top of the agenda for political parties, not just in the US, but across Europe. How did we get to this point where so many societal issues like jobs, crime, housing, to name a few, are blamed on immigration?
Well, in some ways, it has always been the case. Outsiders have always been blamed for our problems and fears. There's nothing new. But I think we are living in a new wave of blaming immigrants for things that worry us. How did we get here? I think what's happened is that there has been an unprecedented wave of both humanitarian, political, and natural disaster type issues that have led to surges of immigrants showing up at borders in ways that are irregular, disorderly, and our immigration systems are quite outdated. We haven't updated them in a long time, and that chaos at the border or chaos at the point of arrival has been certainly real chaos, but it has also been amplified by political parties that have taken advantage of that and used it for political gain. So it's a mix of factors that are, let's call them natural or are really happening, and also perceptions that have been twisted. And here we are.
A lot of fear about immigration seems not to be based on direct experience. It's rather based on feeling. Why do you think so many people instinctively distrust immigrants, even if they have never been personally affected?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and in some ways tells us so much about human nature, right? It is true, actually, that when people have not been exposed to immigrants, that is, they don't have daily interactions with them, they do distrust them, and that's because they trust something else. They trust what they read in the headlines. They trust a very small but highly motivated group of people, whether it's in the media or politicians or on social media, who tell them that there's a problem, even if people, in a curious way, don't see the problem day to day. The biggest predictor, according to research, of people actually having positive feelings toward immigrants is exposure, day-to-day living around them. And so isn't that very interesting, right? That we literally fear what we don't know. And so people who live near immigrants are fine because they see that they go to work, they see that they raise normal children, they see that they pay taxes, that the vast majority of our law-abiding citizens. But then if you hear something so different in the media, you trust that if you don't see the day-to-day. And so it really is about, who do you trust? Do you trust your daily experiences, or do you trust a distorted information environment about immigration?
Immigrants are often expected to prove their loyalty, but native-born citizens don't face the same scrutiny. Why do we hold them to a higher trust standard?
In some ways, there's something that I don't think is wrong about that. We should expect that newcomers are law-abiding. We should expect that they demonstrate that they can be productive citizens. And so I don't have a problem with having standards for outsiders, but it is curious, right, that somehow we do hold them to a higher standard than someone who perhaps was born here and then all of a sudden is causing a lot of problems, but we don't question why they should be here. The good news is that all the evidence tells us that immigrants, if allowed to live, if allowed to work, if allowed to move freely, they are very productive and they're very law-abiding and they do all the things that we would want anyone to do. Most of the problems that immigrants do have are more about how we manage the system than with immigrants themselves. And that's just because immigrants are people like anybody else.
Your book breaks down some of the biggest misconceptions about immigration. If you had to pick just one fact that completely shatters a common idea, what would it be?
Oh, that's so hard to pick one. I I don't know that I'll be able to do that. But instead of perhaps of a fact, let me debunk a very common idea or philosophical point. You can either see immigrants as being in direct competition with native-born people for jobs, for space, for whatever you think is important, or you can see them as complements, win-win. That is, we are better off because of them, they're better off because of us. All the empirical evidence tells us that immigrants don't compete directly with native-born people. They make native-born people better. They grow the economic pie. They make communities safer. And so I would say that we just have to reframe immigration as a competition and think of it as a win-win that is building a future. That would be, at a very high-level principle, it's not necessarily a fact, but all the facts lead to that conclusion. And I'm guessing that in the next questions that you're going to ask me, we can get into some of those facts.
If you turn on the news or listen to politicians, you will hear the same claims again and again. Immigrants take jobs, overwhelm public services and hurt the economy, to say the least. I'm now leaving in the middle the allegations about rape, murder, whatever crimes you can think of. But your research, like you just said, tells a very different story. And just can you share a fact or even a real-world example that challenges this belief in a way that might make people see it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into some facts. Let me ask your listeners just to think of their day-to-day life, okay? From the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, okay? Think about what you have for breakfast when you wake up. Think about the technologies that you use at work to get things done, whether it's your phone, your computer, whether it's Zoom. Think about what you have for lunch during your lunch break. Think about when you get home, what you do for entertainment, what kind of music you listen to, movies, TV shows you watch. Now think of, you go to the store after work and you walk down the aisles and you buy your favorite foods. Think about what you do for exercise or leisure. Now, if you think about your day from sunrise to sunset, so much of those things that you did are affected positively by contributions that immigrants made. For example, most of us use Zoom for our meetings every day. Zoom is something created by an immigrant. If you walk down your supermarket aisle and you think of the foods that you buy normally and you remove the foods that were introduced because of newcomers that introduce new tastes and preferences, ingredients, more than half of your shopping cart would be empty. Okay. If you think about the types of music that you love to listen to, whether it's salsa, rock, whatever you're into, again, an overwhelming percentage of that music or entertainment are things that immigrants created for you. So the point is that when you actually stop to look at the facts, immigrants have made your life so much better, so much more interesting, and so much richer. And we know this very clearly. Now, let me give you some statistics. For example, we know, and this is in the United States, but this is true in many other countries, immigrants are responsible for 36% of all patents, inventions, right? Whether it's new medicines, new technologies that make our lives better or that save our lives. We wouldn't have had the COVID vaccine had it not been for a group of Turkish immigrants who moved to Germany and started BioNTech and then partnered with Pfizer. So there's just so many things every day that make your life better. And the numbers are very clear because of that.
You've done extensive research on the real effects of immigration on businesses and jobs. If you were sitting down with someone who believes immigrants hurt the economy, what's the one fact you'd tell them that might change their mind?
I would go back to this idea that immigrants are competing with natives. And when it comes to the economy, the most common idea that people are distorted by is that immigrants arrive and they compete for jobs with native workers, and they either take those jobs away or because of competition, wages go down. There are even several economists that for some time publish research that purportedly show that. Nothing is further from the truth. The best evidence that we have shows exactly the opposite, that immigrants are a win-win economically. I often use the fingers of my hand, the 5 fingers of my hand, to summarize what the economic research tells us. And it tells us that immigrants bring 5 key inputs that are essential for economic growth and job creation. And those are, first, investment; second, talent; third, innovation; fourth, consumption; and fifth, taxes. Okay, just to repeat myself: investment, talent, innovation, consumption, and taxes. Tell me anyone who doesn't want those 5 things. I don't know any citizen, mayor, governor, president, prime minister who isn't desperate for those 5 things to have a prosperous economy. Immigrants bring all 5 of those things, and those 5 things create jobs. They make our economic pie larger, but importantly, they also make our economies more diversified. Let me quantify some of those 5 things, and I'll use the United States as an example because it's the country I know best because it's where I live. In the United States, immigrants are 80% more likely to invest and start a business than native-born people. Immigrants are, like I said, responsible for 36% of all patents, even though there are only 16% of inventors who patent. Immigrants pay, on average, $260,000 in net present value in taxes after accounting for any public services they use. Immigrants have $1.3 trillion of consumption power, not accounting for the increase in consumption they create among natives. And we could keep going on and on and on. I don't know anybody who doesn't want those things. So the message I often give when I speak to either economists or public officials is that the real question isn't whether we want immigrants or not. The real question is whether we want those 5 economic inputs. And it turns out that if you do, you need immigrants for them. And once you frame it that way, a lot of the debates on insiders versus outsiders fade away because economies are going to wilt and disappear without those 5 inputs.
Just a small question in between. If you talk about immigrants, am I right to assume that we then talk about if it were refugees that have gotten a status to be a part of the US society? Is that correct?
Yeah, so immigrants is anybody who was born in one country and now lives in another. And immigrants arrive through different paths. One of them is refugee or asylee. That would be a humanitarian path, but they are immigrants. There are economic migrants who come on a work visa or come from work. And there are immigrants who arrive to reunite with their families, but they're all immigrants. And the research, despite those different arrival paths, shows that all immigrants bring those 5 things that I just mentioned. We, of course, have to manage those different paths differently, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But in terms of the outcomes, it's all the same.
Right-wing and far-right politicians consistently use immigration to fire up voters, often framing it as a threat. Why is immigration such a powerful political weapon, and how does it exploit public trust, both in governments and in the people coming into a country?
Look, it's always harder to look in the mirror and be accountable for our own problems and realize that we have to do things to fix them than to blame an outsider. And so it has always been a very effective message to say, oh, unemployment is high, blame these outsiders. Crime is going up, blame these outsiders. It's lazy, but it's politically effective. It has always garnered anything from a large minority to sometimes a small majority of votes, enough to get someone elected, to blame outsiders. The message is simple and it's powerful. But it's not just the fault of entrepreneurial politicians who use immigration as a way to get elected. I think it's the fault of those also who are in favor of immigration who don't have a good message. Because, and this is something that I often refer to in my book, really, in every society, there are 2 dominant messages about immigration. One is what I call immigrants as villains. It's what we're just talking about. Immigrants are villains who are here to steal your job, undermine security, destroy your culture. But the opposing message is actually not a good antidote to that message. It's the immigrants as victims message. It's the human rights or the pity message. That is, immigrants are these outsiders, they're needy. We need to be kind, compassionate, maybe because we're richer, maybe because someone helped us before. Therefore, we must welcome immigrants out of pity or compassion, not out of self-interest. The reality is that immigrants are net positive contributors to everything we want for a prosperous society. But no politician and no political party has very consistently shared that message of immigrants as being good for us. And so therefore, there's a vacuum where someone has a untrue but powerful message, immigrants are here to hurt you. And then the alternative is, let's be pitiful and compassionate, which politically doesn't work. So I think that if we had a message grounded in the empirical evidence that immigrants are good for us, we would have a more powerful antidote to what we're seeing in the headlines today.
Beyond crime, do you think this fear is really about something deeper, a broader trust crisis in society?
I think there's something to that. I mean, Severin, you're a bigger expert than I am in trust, but I do think that when social interaction diminishes, when people are not exposed to one another, especially exposed to those who might look differently, speak a little differently, have different religion or other cultural experiences, I think trust does erode. And I think that has happened, whether it's because of the rise of interactions that are mediated by social media, which social media makes it more easy to fall into our own tribes, whether it's the COVID pandemic that reduced interaction among humans for a year or two. I don't know. Those are just speculations. The diminishing face-to-face interaction among humans, I think, is part of the explanation for why we are in a new wave of distrusting outsiders. It's not the only wave in history, but it's certainly a very serious wave right now.
Policies like family separation, mass deportations, and stricter residency restrictions have been proposed or implemented in the past and are currently implemented. Which of these do you think has had the biggest long-term impact on public trust?
I think in some ways it's all of the above. Certainly mass deportations have played a big role, just because mass deportations are based on the premise that immigrants are here to harm you. Again, it's the villain message. In the US, we talk about deporting criminal aliens. In Europe, something very similar. Those images that show up on the screen where someone's being rounded up and handcuffed or put in a cage and taken away, those are very powerful images, right? The imagery makes it seem as if immigrants are overwhelmingly criminal when in fact they have some of the lowest crime rates in the world. They tend to be the group that has the lowest crime rate, maybe not in every country, but in many, many countries, because they have a very powerful incentive. They don't want to break the law because they want to remain and be law-abiding citizens. I would say the other policy that you didn't mention that has had a very serious effect in eroding trust in outsiders and immigrants, and I think this is a policy that actually is enacted more strongly in Europe than in the United States, is housing immigrants in concentrated neighborhoods, whether it's the banlieues in Paris, whether it's ghettos in certain places. And sometimes that comes out of a compassionate desire to help immigrants, particularly humanitarian immigrants, that we put them in specific neighborhoods, all in one apartment complex, all in one part of the city. And what's the problem? You don't have social interaction between immigrants and natives. And so then immigrants are othered. They are in that neighborhood. They interact with each other. That, again, erodes trust. Interaction between humans, and I know I'm repeating myself, is the number one thing that reduces prejudice and increases trust. And you realize that that person next door to you is a lot like you. That's a policy that is very, very damaging. And it actually comes from a compassionate place, but it does more damage than good. So we need to house immigrants scattered around places, not concentrated.
You make an important distinction between integration and assimilation. Why does integration build more trust, both for immigrants and the host country?
This comes from research in psychology. John Barry and his colleagues over some decades developed the dominant model of acculturation. And it shows that basically, if you think about an immigrant having a mother culture and a new culture, I'm an immigrant, actually. I'm from the little country of Uruguay in South America. I now live in the United States. So my mother culture is from Uruguay. My new culture is the American culture. People who worry about immigrants assimilating into society see these two cultures as two opposite ends of a continuum. You move towards one, you move away from the other. They're competing cultures. And so their model of assimilation is that an immigrant has to give up their mother culture and embrace the new culture. But actually, psychologists have shown that that's not true. Cultures are not opposite ends of a continuum. They are orthogonal. That is, they are two perpendicular lines. And so that means that people can have a strong attachment to both, a strong attachment to just one, or a strong attachment to neither. Having a strong attachment to both is what psychologists call integration of both cultures. And research very clearly shows that integration is the psychologically most healthy for the immigrant, because giving up your mother culture, I mean, imagine you, Severin, if I tell you give up your Dutch heritage, that's not only impossible to do, it's very painful because it generates an identity crisis. But that doesn't mean that I can't have a strong attachment to both. I love everything that makes me Uruguayan, but it doesn't mean I can't love everything that makes me American. I have integrated both, and I'm very well adjusted to my adopted country. So integration, by being psychologically safe for immigrants, allows them to interact in more productive ways with their native counterparts. And the side benefit of that is that it also allows immigrants to preserve new ideas, new foods, new tastes that enrich the receiving culture. They don't replace it, but they enrich it. And you see it in the things that I mentioned earlier that you do on your day-to-day life.
Can you share a real-life example of an immigrant group that successfully integrated in a way that breaks common stereotypes?
Yes, there are many, of course, but I'll give you one of them that I think is very telling because it's a group of immigrants that is often vilified, and that would be Muslim immigrants in the Detroit, Michigan area. Detroit has, I think, if not the highest, one of the highest concentrations of Arab Muslims in the United States. Dearborn, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit in particular. So it's a place that if you go there, you'll see big mosques and you'll see a lot of Arabs and Muslims there. Now, of course, Muslims are one of the most distrusted and controversial groups of immigrants. I know that's true in Europe, for example. And the immigrants in Detroit have managed to integrate, not assimilate. That is, they haven't given up their Arab traditions or foods necessarily. Many of them remain devout Muslims. But they have integrated in the sense that they have fully embraced American democracy. Many of them have become successful politicians, businessmen. They have a very high rate of education. Some of them marry within their religion. Many marry outside their religion, usually in the second or third generation. But they are a group that is very well integrated into the fabric of Michigan, into the fabric of the United States. And they are not the stereotypical terrorist Muslim that everyone thinks that they would have become. But again, why is that? It's because the state of Michigan has done a good job in just letting them be, just letting them live, letting them work, letting their kids go to schools with other kids, not concentrating them in one neighborhood, although there are neighborhoods that are more predominantly Arab Muslim in Dearborn than others, but not forcing them into that. And so I think that when you see Arab Muslims do well in, say, majority Christian countries, it's because they're allowed to live as opposed to being concentrated in one place and vilified.
If you were in the position to redesign the US or European immigration system from scratch, what would be the first three things you'd change?
If only I had that much power.
Yes.
Look, I think the first thing is, and this might seem strange to be the first thing, but it would be a reframing of policy priorities away from humanitarian support and towards economic growth. I'll give you a good example. A country that's done this in Europe recently is Spain. Spain in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years has been one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, especially in the last 2 or 3. I just read an article about this morning. And it has done so by embracing immigration as an economic solution. You see what some of the policymakers talk about, and they talk very clearly about immigration as an economic tool, as opposed to immigration as a humanitarian issue. So in the United States, that would look like taking responsibility from immigration away from Department of Homeland Security. I mean, what does that tell you? That Department of Homeland Security manages our immigration system, and give it to Department of Commerce. Very different framing. And you might think that's symbolic. Well, it is, but it's not just symbolic, because if the officials that are thinking about immigration policy every day are thinking about protection, they're going to make very different decisions than if they're thinking about economic growth, job creation, increasing commerce, trade, etc. So that would be the first. The second is that we need to face the reality that we're in a demographic crisis, and we need to increase the legal pathways significantly. The US and Europe simply do not allow enough immigrants legally. They simply do not. With our birth rates shrinking, with people aging, with fewer people entering workforces, we need to double or triple the number of immigrants we allow. A restrictive environment makes no sense given the demographic profile of most rich countries. And then the third thing I would do is have a more balanced system where we have a lot of different pathways for both skilled and unskilled immigrants. Part of the fallacy of many countries is that they say, well, we want immigrants, but only the skilled kind, only the ones with masters and PhDs. We don't want these unskilled people who have no education. But the reality is that we need both. They're inseparable. And I'll give you two examples. One of them is unskilled people enable skilled people to do their work. If no one is picking fruit or food, if no one is working in farms, if no one is working in manufacturing,
or taking care of our kids,
or taking care of your kids, one of the two people in the family will have to stay home or work fewer hours. And so that's at the level of society. But even at the level of a company, think of a company like Amazon, one of the biggest companies in the world, at least in the United States. Yes, they need engineers from India and China who do their coding and build their software. But without unskilled workers in their factories or doing deliveries, those skilled engineers can't benefit the company as much. So this fallacy of separating skilled from unskilled is just silly. I think if we do those three things, we'll have a system that is sane, and also a system that is based on doing good for us as opposed to us doing good for them, which is always a very weird framing of our immigration system.
My last question, Zeke, is a more personal one, and very curious about what drove you to study this subject. You spent years researching immigration, but has there been a personal story, maybe from someone you met or interviewed, that truly changed the way you see this issue?
Again, a very insightful question, and one that I could answer in many different ways. Let me start with giving you two answers. I have been an immigrant in 4 or 5 different countries. I was the son of a father who worked for a big multinational organization. And so I lived in different countries as he was doing his job as I was growing up. That opened my eyes to both the benefits and also the risks and challenges of cross-border exchange. People can do great things when people from different backgrounds get together. It's also, you can have great conflict. It's a choice in terms of what we do about it. There's one story that really changed my perspective beyond my own. So I live in Philadelphia. I work for the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. When I moved here about 12 years ago, I needed a haircut, and I went to a barber shop near to my home. And I met a barber who is from a foreign country in South America. And over the years, he has remained my barber. So we've become very close. And over the years, I've learned that he's actually an undocumented immigrant in the United States. He's not here with legal permission. He is very good at his job, not because I look good. There's nobody can make me look good, but he's very good because he just is very skilled. People wait in line for him. He's actually won awards for his skills as a barber. He confessed to me that one of his lifelong wishes has been to start his own barber shop. And one time he shared with me that he had 200,000 US dollars saved, ready to start his own business. And I just about fell off my chair because I was like, you have how much money in cash ready to invest? I just couldn't believe it. And I asked him, I said, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you start your barber? I mean, clearly you're the best barber in the neighborhood, right? Your customers would all follow you. You would create jobs. You would pay taxes as a business. I mean, this would be really good for all of us. Uh-huh. And he said, well, I would love to, but my legal status prevents me from doing so. I cannot start a business legally. because I'm here without authorization. Why did that change my perspective? Because when we think of undocumented or illegal or irregular immigrants, the image on television is of someone who's sneaking here to steal everything and rape your daughter and take everything and use public services. But in reality, the modal undocumented immigrant is exactly like my barber, someone who works hard, who has skill, and their lack of legal status prevents them from giving us all the benefits they could. Think of the jobs, the taxes, and other benefits that we would have if he were allowed to invest his money in his barbershop. And so once we realize that, it completely changes the frame, and it allows us to trust these people as doing good for us. And it's unfortunate that we vilify them instead of realizing that when we do so, it's not that we hurt them, which we do, it's that we hurt ourselves. We hurt ourselves. That would be the biggest message I would leave the listeners today. We hurt ourselves by creating barriers to immigration or by having systems that don't allow for orderly immigration to get all the benefits that we should be getting.
Zeke, you're talking to the converted because I feel exactly the same way. But if you are realistic and you look at current status, both in, for example, Germany, my own country, and the United States, what happens with immigration, don't you have the feel that you're fighting a losing battle?
Yes, lately it does feel that way. There has been a wave of xenophobic or anti-immigrant policies in many countries, not just the country in which I live. So it does feel that we're losing the battle at this moment. At the same time, there are two things that make me hopeful. One of them is that the facts are very clear. The empirical evidence is very, very clear. Immigration is good for us. The anti-immigrant movements in the world don't have a solid empirical basis. It's a house of cards that will fall apart once their policies start to create economic harm. The other is that the long-term demographic trends are such that in the next 10 to 20 years, or maybe even 30, countries are going to go from being immigration choosers to being immigration beggars. Because where are people going to come from? Where are talent, taxpayers? They're not going to come from our own countries. They're going to come from the outside, and there's an increasingly limited supply of people being born in the world, which means that countries are going to be competing for talent and immigrants. And I think that immigration will be politically popular, not maybe in 5 to 10 years, but in 20 to 30. I think in my lifetime, we will see immigration become something that's desirable and that politicians will compete for rather than what we're seeing now. It just takes patience. So I'm discouraged in the short run, but I'm positive in the long run.
You know, if you look at the history of your own country, your current country, I think it's the biggest proof. The United States is a country of immigrants, right?
Yes.
So that used to be, but we're talking about maybe 200 years ago. So I hope that within the next 200 years, much earlier actually, that will happen what you just described. I think it's a good note to end our interview. Thank you very much for your insights. By the way, your book, does it do well?
You know, it's doing well. An author always wishes they would sell more copies, but in my case, I didn't write the book to make money. You don't make a lot of money with books. I wrote the book because I really care about the message. So I think it has done well enough in terms of giving me opportunities to speak with people like you and expand the message. And I hope that more and more people will read it just to realize that there are very powerful arguments to be optimistic about. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.